stock, and I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the difference between chicken stock and chicken broth before we get things on the stove and get them going. I'm actually going to be working outside on our camp stove because this pot is so big and takes up so much space in my kitchen. It's great to do it outside in the patio on the camp stove. Plus, if you spill, cleanup is a lot easier. I have chicken carcasses inside of this big pot. I have a lot left over from our chicken butchering day. So we broke down some of our chickens and parted out the pieces and froze them for later use, but I have all the carcasses and bones and I don't want them to go to waste. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to use the mirepoix and some of the herbs that I have set out here to make a chicken stock, but I wanted to talk about why broth is different. So broth is made with the meat and vegetables. So you might take an entire piece of chicken and simmer it down for a short period of time to make something that's a little bit thinner. It's going to have great chicken flavor, but it's going to be milder compared to stock. Technically, anything with meat in it that's simmered is counted as broth, and people really like it for a lighter flavored thing. If you want to make dishes, for example, if you want to cook your rice in chicken broth, that's a really great way to use it. You'll get a light flavor, but it doesn't overwhelm the rice. You do the same thing with mashed potatoes, or use it when you're making your stuffing. There's lots of ways to use it that gives a light flavor, but doesn't have that real strong stock flavor. The other thing that people really like to do with it is just to drink it like a hot cup of tea because it has really good health benefits and it tastes great. Generally, broth is fully seasoned. It'll have herbs and salt ready to use. Okay, let's talk about stock. Stock is made using the bones, the carcasses, maybe the necks. We're going to be using feet as well because there's a lot of gelatin in there that's very, very good for the health benefits that you get from stock, and it adds a lot more flavor. Stock is generally cooked for 2 to 6 to 8 hours, so it's a longer cooking time than broth is going to be. Generally, stock is made by using mirepoix and some herbs, but not a lot of salt. Broth is made with salt, stock is made without salt or very little. You're going to want to salt to your needs based on the recipe that you're making that day. Stock is going to have a more developed flavor. It's much stronger and more robust. It's great for using when you're deglazing a pan. Let's say that you made a roasted chicken and you want to deglaze the pan when you're finished. I would grab stock to use for that because that'll become the base to a really good soup that I'll make the next day. If we make a roasted chicken or a roasted anything around here, we're almost always going to get a pot of soup the next day. Stock has a more gelatinous texture because you are going to draw out more of the gelatin from the bones in the cooking time. Remember, that longer cooking time is what matters. All right, the third category is called bone broth, and this is something that is really neither a thin broth nor a hearty stock. It's something entirely different. We call it bone broth, but it really is more like a stock because it's a long cooking time. Sometimes I cook this up to 24 hours. When I'm finished making a bone broth, it's similar to making stock, but you're going to cook it for a lot longer. And when I'm finished with it, generally the bones will crumble. They actually become so soft that they break apart. You can actually feel it in your hands. It'll just come apart. You're drawing all the minerals and all that gelatin out of the bones. This has the best health benefit that you can imagine. For some time, years ago, my son was quite sick, and we made bone broth for him to help heal. There's a lot of healing benefit in that gelatin. It has a very strong flavor. It's got a very minerally flavor. So it's not necessarily used in cooking, but it is excellent for health benefits. The long cooking time of bone broth draws out the most collagen protein. It's definitely a thicker texture and it's not for everyone, but if you're looking for the best health benefit that you can get, good organic chicken bones or good organic beef bones make an excellent bone broth. I'll type up the recipe that I use to make the chicken stock that we're making today, and I'll overlay it in the edit here when I put it together for you. But generally what we're starting with is your chicken carcasses. In our case, this includes the necks and the feet. This pot is almost full. And then we're going to use carrots and celery. So I had some celery growing in the garden that didn't fully develop, but these leaves add great flavor, and we're just going to go ahead and throw them in whole. My carrots, I don't peel. I don't believe in peeling carrots. I just wash them really well and we throw them in. They're going to be almost disintegrated by the time I'm done cooking stock. I also have some additional celery that I've cut into pieces, some onions to throw in, and I always add raw whole clove garlic and some peppercorns and bay leaves into my stock. And then I just had some parsley growing in the garden that's kind of the end of its season, but it still adds great flavor, so we're putting that in too. This is it. This, some water, and the bones that we have here is all that's going in. I'm just going to put everything in, add the water, put it on the stove, and we're going to let this simmer 6 to 8 hours or so. During the process, it's important to come along and skim off any scum that might develop on the top. Sometimes as we draw the minerals out of the bones, you'll see some of that foam floating to the top, and you can skim it off and separate it out. Well, after a few hours of cooking time, we haven't had any of that scum develop on the top yet. We are seeing really nice broth development, which is awesome, but it's only been 2 to 3 hours, so we're still in the broth stage. We haven't moved into the stock stage yet. So I'm going to move my vegetables down to the bottom, get the herbs blended down through so everything can continue to cook, and we're going to let it go for quite a few more hours. It gets dark early around here this time of year, so we're working in the dark, but it's still actually early in the evening. I don't see any impurities really developing on the top of this, so I'm really happy to not have to skim anything off of it. I'm seeing a little bit collect around the edges, but I'll just leave that there. But as I stir, you can see the bones are really breaking down. Oh, it smells amazing out here. Wish we had smell-o-vision. I have a few more hours and I'm going to let this go, but I just want to give it a stir and make sure that it's good to go. The bones are starting to break down, but we need a little bit more time. When we're finished, we're going to take the entire thing and strain off all of these vegetables and bones, and then we're going to put it in the refrigerator overnight. Well, 8 hours of cooking time have produced very soft bones and very soft vegetables that are starting to come apart. So I'm going to go ahead and take my spider and pull off all the bones and the vegetables and set them aside and pour the remaining broth through a strainer to separate it out. This pot is so heavy I can't lift it myself.
Yep, just gonna have to kind of commit.
Thank goodness my boys were home able to help me out. So one holds the strainer, two do the pouring, and we were able to dump all of this into a smaller pot and separate out all of this delicious broth.
Amazing.
You want to have soup?
Yeah, we got some spillage, but that's all right.
So we use the strainer to separate all the vegetables and bone pieces that remain.
You're fully leaning now.
Well, I think it's going to fit.
I do too.
What remains in this pot is going to go ahead out to my chickens so that they can have a good snack. They'll eat this celery and carrots and even the pieces of bones until their heart's content.
Got it. Mm-hmm.
Guys, but he'll need that pot to put this in. Otherwise,
he's gonna he's gonna need something to forgive me.
Despite a little bit of a mess on the floor, we were able to make some delicious, delicious stock we can't wait to use.
I can't. Okay, never mind.
Thank you.
That'll work. Alright. Yum. That's some gloriousness right there.
It smells amazing. Well, what remains? A bowl full of vegetables, some pieces of chicken, and some bones that are so soft they can easily break into pieces. This is going to go outside to my chickens, who will eat it. Chickens are carnivores, so they're happy to eat the vegetables, the meat, and the bones, and they'll derive lots of good minerals from this. This follows our philosophy of not letting anything go to waste. Luckily, my extra refrigerator has enough room for this big pot, but I'll make sure that when I set up the recipe, I set it up on a smaller scale. I recognize that not everybody has 10 chicken carcasses available to make such a large pot at one time. But a small pot, even, you just want to drop it into the refrigerator, let it sit overnight, and what's going to happen is the fat is going to rise to the top, and the next day it'll solidify enough that you can scrape that off. Our chicken doesn't have much fat on it. I trimmed most of it, but you'd be amazed how much appears after you're done the cooking process. You see the impurities on top there? I'm going to scrape those away. So after I scrape away all this yellow fat that rose to the top of my pot, I have access to all this awesome gelatinous stock that's underneath of it. And it's thick and gelatinous like this, not because it's fatty, but because I've drawn out all of this good nutrition and good gelatin from the bones while I was cooking it. This we're going to go ahead and put into containers and start to freeze. You can save every Chinese food container that you've ever had, or you can go ahead and buy a sleeve of these online, have them shipped out to the house, which is what I chose to do. When you're filling these up, just make sure that you leave a little space at the top so that if it expands when it freezes, it doesn't blow the lid off the top of it. You can see here that once you get to room temperature, it's relatively thin compared to what you just saw in the pot when it was cold. This is an excellent base for any pot of soup that you want to make or the beginning of any delicious dish. If you don't have the freezer space and you want to can it, you're just going to want to follow the recipe rules in your USDA guidelines for doing chicken stock. And that is 25 minutes at 1,000 feet or 20 minutes below 1,000 feet at 10 pounds of pressure. Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope you make some chicken stock soon, and leave me a comment below if you have any questions. I'd be happy to answer them, and subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you know about new videos coming up soon.